Humiliated nurse discovers baby is the son of her former patient. Have you ever stopped to think about how a single moment can completely change the course of a life? How a simple choice, an unexpected encounter, or a revelation can transform everything we thought we knew about ourselves? The story I'm going to tell today is about Marina, a dedicated 32-year-old nurse who worked tirelessly for years in one of São Paulo's most important hospitals. Marina was known for her competence, her empathy with patients, and her ability to remain calm even in the most difficult situations. She was the kind of professional everyone would want by their side in a moment of vulnerability, the kind of person who can convey security with just a look. But life has a peculiar way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them, and Marina was about to discover this in the most painful way possible. This is a story about humiliation, about secrets kept for years, about the courage to face the past, and above all, about how the truth always finds its way to us, no matter how long it takes. It's a story that makes us reflect on hasty judgments, on the masks we wear in society, and on how we never fully know what's going on in the lives of the people around us. Marina had an established routine, a life that seemed to be on track, but all of that was about to crumble in a way she could never have imagined. And it all started with a baby, a cry that echoed through the hospital corridors and awakened memories she had buried deep in her heart. Paragraph d'auteur. It was an ordinary Tuesday in March when Marina woke up to her alarm clock ringing at 5:30 a.m. She got up, made her coffee as usual, put on her impeccably white uniform, and headed to the hospital where she had worked for almost 10 years. The bus ride took 40 minutes, time she usually used to mentally organize her tasks for the day. Marina lived alone in a small rented apartment in the east side of the city, a simple but organized place that perfectly reflected her methodical and reserved personality. She never had many close friends, preferring to keep professional relationships within the workplace and rarely sharing details of her personal life with colleagues. Some considered her distant, others simply respected her privacy. What no one knew was that Marina carried a secret, a silent weight she had learned to hide behind polite smiles and superficial conversations. 5 years ago, she had gone through a situation that completely changed her perspective on life, on relationships, and on trust. But this was something she kept only to herself, locked away somewhere deep in her soul, a place she didn't even like to visit. On that particular morning, as the bus sped through the still-awake streets of the city, Marina had no idea that this would be the day her past and present would inevitably collide. She couldn't imagine that upon entering the hospital doors, her life would never be the same again. Upon arriving at the hospital, Marina briefly greeted the receptionist and went straight to the women's changing room. She changed her clothes, styled her hair in a neat bun, and checked her badge before going up to the 4th floor, where the maternity ward was located. In recent months, she had been transferred to that sector, a change that initially made her uncomfortable. Working surrounded by babies and happy mothers stirred something within her, awakening feelings she preferred to keep dormant. But Marina was professional. She knew how to separate her personal emotions from her work and quickly adapted to the new routine. That morning, she took her post in the nursery room, where several newborns rested in their transparent cribs, tiny human beings who had arrived in the world only hours or days before. Marina was always amazed by the fragility of those little creatures, with their tiny hands and wrinkled faces. She cared for each one with extreme delicacy, checking vital signs, changing diapers, and administering medication when necessary. It was a job that demanded constant attention, infinite patience, and above all, a lot of love. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, one of her colleagues, Nurse Patricia, entered the nursery with a worried expression. She informed her that there was a delicate situation in room 215, a mother who was having difficulties breastfeeding and who specifically requested the help of a more experienced nurse. Marina agreed to help, not imagining that this simple act of kindness would lead her directly to the encounter that would change everything. Marina knocked lightly on the door of room 215 before entering. The room was dimly lit, with only natural light filtering through the window, which was partially covered by light blue curtains. On the bed, a young woman, appearing to be about 25 years old, held a baby in her arms with visible discomfort. She had well-groomed blonde hair, perfectly manicured nails, and wore an expensive silk nightgown that certainly wasn't provided by the hospital. Beside the bed, seated in a comfortable armchair, was a man in an impeccable suit, fiddling with his cell phone with an air of impatience. Marina introduced herself in her professional and gentle voice, offering help with breastfeeding. The young mother looked at her with an expression that mixed despair and exhaustion. The baby cried incessantly, a high-pitched cry that filled the entire room. Marina approached, reaching out to take the child and help with the correct positioning, when something strange happened. Her eyes met the eyes of the man sitting in the armchair, and for a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop. She knew that face. She knew those brown eyes, that specific eyebrow shape, that defined chin. Her heart raced, her hands began to tremble slightly, and she had to make a conscious effort to maintain her professional composure. The man looked back at her, but his expression remained neutral, without any sign of recognition. Could it be that he didn't recognize her? Or was he just pretending not to remember? Marina swallowed hard, forced a smile, and turned her attention back to the baby and the mother, but her heart was pounding so hard, she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Marina worked on autopilot for the next 15 minutes, helping the young mother with breastfeeding techniques, adjusting the baby's position, offering words of encouragement, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew that man. His name was Raphael, and 5 years ago, he had been her patient at the same hospital, under very different circumstances. At that time, Raphael was recovering from a car accident, spending 2 weeks hospitalized, and Marina was one of the nurses responsible for his care. During that period, they talked a lot, developed a special connection, or at least that's what Marina had believed. Raphael seemed different from the other patients, more attentive, more interested in getting to know her as a person and not just as a professional. He asked questions about her life, her dreams, her stories. Marina, who had always been reserved, found herself opening her heart to that man in a way she never had before. When Raphael was discharged, he asked for her phone number, and Marina, for the first time in years, allowed someone into her life in a more intimate way. What happened next was something she preferred to forget, something that hurt her deeply and made her build even higher walls around her heart. And now, 5 years later, he was there, in that hospital room, with a young, beautiful wife and a newborn baby, looking at her as if he had never seen her before. Marina finished her work, gave the new mother her last instructions, and left the room with trembling legs, feeling as if the ground could disappear beneath her feet at any moment. Marina walked quickly down the corridor, desperately searching for a place where she could be alone for a few moments. Her hands still trembled, and she felt a pressure in her chest that made it difficult to breathe properly. She entered the women's restroom, locked herself in one of the stalls, and rested her hands on the cold wall, trying to regain control of her emotions. How was it possible that after 5 years, after all the effort she had made to move on, Raphael simply reappeared in her life like this? And worst of all was the way he looked at her, or rather, how he didn't look at her. That empty, unrecognized expression, as if she were just another nurse providing a service. Did he really not recognize her? Or was he just pretending because of his wife's presence? Marina closed her eyes and allowed the memories she had so carefully locked away to begin to return. 5 years ago, when Raphael was hospitalized, he had been different from any patient she had ever cared for. He was charismatic, well-mannered, and had a smile that lit up the room even when he was dealing with the pain of his injuries. Marina perfectly remembered the long conversations they had during night shifts, when the hospital was quieter and she had more time to stay by his bedside. Raphael would talk about his dreams of expanding the family business, about his travels around the world, about how that accident had made him rethink his priorities in life. And Marina, who had always been so careful to maintain emotional distance from her patients, found herself sharing her own stories, her fears, her hopes. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, understood, special. When Raphael asked for her phone number on the day of her discharge, Marina hesitated for only a second before accepting. She knew she was breaking her own rules, but something about that man made her want to take the risk. What she didn't know was that that risk would cost her much more than she was prepared to pay. After Raphael left the hospital, they began communicating daily. Text messages during the day, long phone calls at night. Raphael seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her better, asking questions about her childhood, her family, her personal tastes. Marina, who had grown up in a humble family in the interior of São Paulo, had never experienced this kind of attention before. Her parents were simple, hard-working people who did everything possible to ensure she could study and become a nurse. She was the first in her family to graduate from university, a source of immense pride for everyone. But her life had always been focused on work, on building a solid career, and little room was left for personal relationships. Raphael changed that. He invited her to dinner at elegant restaurants that Marina only knew in passing, took her to places in the city she had never visited, introduced her to a world completely different from the one she lived in. Marina felt like a fairy tale character, living a story that seemed too good to be true. And perhaps that was exactly it, too good to be true. For 3 months, they saw each other regularly. Raphael was attentive, romantic, and always had the right words at the right time. Marina allowed herself to believe that she had finally found someone special, someone with whom she could build a future. She even began to imagine what it would be like to introduce him to her parents, what it would be like to have someone by her side during life's important moments. But then, suddenly, everything changed. Raphael started taking longer to respond to her messages, canceled 2 dates in a row citing urgent work commitments, and his calls became increasingly rare and brief. Marina tried to understand, tried to be understanding. After all, she knew he had a demanding professional life. But something inside her sensed that something was wrong. An intuition she tried to ignore, but which persisted uncomfortably. The truth came in a way Marina could never have predicted. One Saturday afternoon, she was shopping at the supermarket near her house when she saw Raphael walking hand in hand with a stunning blonde woman. They were laughing, clearly comfortable with each other, with an intimacy that only comes from an established relationship. Marina felt like she'd been punched in the gut. She stood paralyzed in the middle of the aisle, clutching a shopping basket, watching the man who had occupied her thoughts for the past few months act as if she didn't exist. She considered approaching him, confronting him, demanding an explanation, but something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of confirming what she already suspected. Marina simply put her basket down and left the supermarket, wandering aimlessly through the streets until darkness began to fall. That night, she texted Raphael directly, asking if there was someone else. His reply came 3 hours later, short and devastating. He said he thought things between them were casual, that he never promised anything serious, and that yes, he had been in a relationship with someone else for years. Marina read that message repeatedly, trying to process how she had misinterpreted everything. How had she allowed herself to believe in something that clearly never existed in the way she imagined? The feeling of humiliation was overwhelming. She felt naive, stupid, used. Raphael never responded to her messages again after that night, and Marina vowed to herself that she would never again allow anyone to make her feel that way. She built even higher walls around her heart, became even more reserved at work, and buried that experience deep in her memory in a place she rarely dared to look. Until that Tuesday morning, when the past literally knocked on her door in the form of a crying baby. Marina left the bathroom stall, washed her face with cold water, and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were slightly red, but she hadn't cried. She had learned long ago that tears solved nothing. She straightened her uniform, redid her bun, and took 3 deep breaths before leaving. She needed to get back to work. She needed to maintain the professional composure that had always been her trademark. The rest of the day passed in a confused blur. Marina performed her tasks mechanically, cared for the babies, assisted other mothers, filled out medical records, but her mind constantly returned to room 215. She avoided going down that corridor for the rest of the day, asking other colleagues to handle any calls that came from that room. Patricia asked if she was feeling well, noticing that Marina was paler than usual, but she just smiled and said everything was fine, that maybe she was starting to catch a cold. When her shift finally ended at 6 in the afternoon, Marina practically ran to the locker room, changed clothes in record time, and left the hospital without saying goodbye to anyone. On the bus ride home, she stared out the window, watching the city go by without really seeing anything. Her mind was full of unanswered questions. Why was Raphael there? Why now? And that woman? Was she the same one she saw at the supermarket 5 years ago? The baby seemed to be only a few days old, which meant that Raphael had built a complete life since their last contact. He got married, started a family, moved on as if Marina had never existed. And why did this still affect her so much? Why, after all this time, did seeing him again have the power to destabilize her in this way? When Marina arrived at her apartment, she threw her bag on the sofa and went straight to the kitchen to make tea. It was her end-of-day ritual, something that calmed her after stressful shifts. But that night, not even the chamomile tea could relieve the tension that was building up in her shoulders. She turned on the television just to have some background noise, but she didn't pay attention to anything on the screen. Her mind kept returning to that hospital room, to Raphael's empty gaze, to the baby's crying, to the young mother in her expensive clothes and her air of fragility. Marina found herself thinking things that weren't worthy of her, feeling a pang of something resembling envy, mixed with anger and an old sadness she thought she had overcome. She picked up her cell phone and, without thinking much, opened a social network she rarely used. Her fingers typed Raphael's name almost of their own accord. It wasn't difficult to find him. After all, he had a public profile as a successful businessman. And there was his whole life exposed in perfectly filtered photographs. Wedding photos from 3 years ago in a stunning location overlooking the sea. Photos from trips to exotic destinations. Photos celebrating professional achievements. And more recently, photos announcing the pregnancy, with his wife showing off her growing belly and Raphael beside her with a proud smile. The last post was from 2 days ago, a photo still in the hospital, with the caption announcing the birth of their son, named Gabriel, and thanking God for the blessing. Marina felt a lump in her throat. There was visual proof of everything she had lost, or rather, everything she never truly had. Raphael moved on without looking back, building exactly the life he always wanted, while she remained stuck in that moment of humiliation 5 years ago, allowing that experience to define all her future relationships. She angrily closed the app, threw her phone on the sofa, and decided she wouldn't think about it anymore. But of course, that was easier said than done. In the following days, Marina did everything she could to avoid room 215. She swapped shifts with colleagues, invented urgent tasks in other wards, anything to avoid facing Raphael again. But in a hospital, especially a maternity ward, it was impossible to completely avoid certain patients. On Thursday, 3 days after their first encounter, Marina was in the hallway organizing some medications when she heard Raphael's voice behind her. Her whole body stiffened. He was asking for information about discharge procedures, inquiring when his wife and baby could go home. Marina kept her back turned, pretending to be busy with what she was doing, but she knew she couldn't completely ignore him without seeming rude or strange. She turned slowly, put on her most convincing professional mask, and began explaining the standard procedures, keeping her voice neutral and her eyes focused on a point just above his head. Raphael listened attentively, asking specific questions about newborn care, demonstrating that he was a concerned and attentive father. Marina answered everything efficiently, but without any extra warmth, without any indication that they had met before. Then something unexpected happened. After explaining about the necessary vaccinations in the first few months, there was a brief silence, and Raphael looked her directly in the eyes for the first time since that Tuesday morning. And in that look, Marina saw it. She saw recognition. He knew who she was. He always had. The impact of this realization was like an electric shock running through her body. Raphael hadn't forgotten her. He was simply pretending, probably to avoid any embarrassment in front of his wife. The confirmation of this truth was somehow worse than if he hadn't actually recognized her. It meant that he consciously chose to act as if she didn't exist, as if those 3 months 5 years ago had meant absolutely nothing. Marina managed to end the conversation without showing the turmoil of emotions she felt inside. She politely said goodbye and walked away, maintaining her upright and professional posture until she turned the corner of the hallway. Only then did she allow her shoulders to slump slightly, releasing a sigh she hadn't even known she was holding. The rest of the day was torturous. She made small mistakes she never made, forgot to write down important information, mixed up medications twice before realizing her error in time. Her colleagues began to genuinely worry, but Marina insisted she was just tired, that she hadn't slept well in the last few days. Which was true. She had barely slept since Tuesday. Every night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, reliving memories she had tried to forget, questioning every decision she had made back then. Had she misinterpreted the signs from the beginning? Had Raphael never really promised anything serious, as he said, and had she simply built a castle of expectations based on nothing concrete? Or had he always been dishonest, manipulative, someone who amused himself with her feelings while keeping his true life hidden? Marina didn't know which of the two options was worse. On Friday, she learned from Patricia that the family from room 215 would be discharged on Saturday morning. Marina felt a mixture of relief and something she couldn't quite identify. Part of her wanted Raphael to simply disappear from her life again, that she could return to her quiet and predictable routine. But another part of her, a part she didn't want to admit existed, felt that there was something unfinished, unspoken words that needed to be expressed. She didn't yet know that fate had very different plans for her, plans that would make it impossible to simply leave everything in the past. Saturday dawned cloudy with that heavy air that usually precedes a storm. Marina had the day off, but had agreed to swap shifts with a colleague who needed to take care of personal matters. Part of her regretted this decision, knowing that she would probably run into Raphael and his family during the discharge process. But another part of her, that stubborn part that always made her face difficult situations head-on, wanted to be there. She wanted to prove to herself that she had overcome it, that his presence no longer had power over her. She arrived at the hospital at 7 in the morning and immediately knew that something was different. There was unusual commotion in the maternity ward, nurses running from one side to the other, doctors being urgently summoned. Marina sought out Patricia to understand what was happening and discovered that the baby in room 215, little Gabriel, had experienced complications during the night. He had a high fever, and the doctors suspected an infection that could be serious. The discharge had been canceled, and the baby was being transferred to the neonatal ICU. Marina's heart sank. Regardless of the complicated history with Raphael, this was an innocent baby, a fragile little creature who was not to blame for anything. Her nature as a nurse, that deep empathy that made her choose this profession, spoke louder than any personal resentment. She immediately offered to help in any way she could. In the following hours, Marina worked intensely, helping the medical team monitor Gabriel's condition, administering medications, checking vital signs every 15 minutes, doing everything in her power to ensure that this baby received the best possible care. She was so focused on her work that she almost forgot the complicated personal dynamics involved in that situation. It was only when she left the neonatal ICU to get more supplies that Marina saw Raphael sitting in the waiting room. He was alone, his head in his hands, in a posture of complete despair. All the masks of confidence and success had fallen, revealing only a father terrified by the possibility of losing his son. Marina hesitated for a moment, internally debating whether she should simply walk past or say something. It was her compassionate nature that won out. She approached slowly and said in a soft voice that Gabriel was in good hands, that the team was doing everything possible, and that babies were more resilient than they seemed. Raphael raised his head, and Marina saw tears in his eyes. At that moment, he wasn't the successful businessman. He wasn't the man who had hurt her 5 years ago. He was simply a frightened father. And then he did something completely unexpected. He said, his voice breaking, that he had recognized Marina from the first moment, that he had never forgotten her, and that walking past her, pretending not to know her, was one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. He said he deeply regretted how he had treated her 5 years ago, that at the time he was confused, immature, and trapped in a complicated relationship that eventually became his marriage. He said Marina deserved much more than he was able to offer, and that he had often thought about seeking her out to apologize, but never had the courage. Marina stood completely still, processing those words she never imagined she would hear. Part of her wanted to scream, wanted to tell him how much he had hurt her, how much that experience had changed the way she related to people. But looking at his state at that moment, seeing his genuine vulnerability, she couldn't find anger within herself. Only a deep sadness for everything that could have been different if he had been honest from the beginning. Before Marina could respond, a nurse emerged from the ICU calling for Raphael. There was an update on Gabriel's condition. They went in together and discovered that the baby had responded well to the antibiotics. His fever was going down, and his vital signs were stabilizing. He would still need to be kept under observation for a few days, but the worst of the danger had passed. The relief on Raphael's face was palpable. He repeatedly thanked the medical team, and his eyes sought Marina's with silent gratitude. In the following days, a strange dynamic developed. Marina continued to be one of the nurses responsible for caring for Gabriel in the neonatal ICU and inevitably crossed paths with Raphael during her visits. They began exchanging brief conversations, always about the baby at first, but gradually including other topics. Raphael talked about how his marriage was far from perfect, how he and his wife had married more out of family pressure and social convenience than out of true love, and how Gabriel's birth was bringing to the surface all the problems they had been avoiding for years. Marina found herself in a strange position, half confessor, half spectator of a life she once imagined she could be a part of. She didn't understand why Raphael was sharing all this with her, but she didn't interrupt him either. Perhaps because finally hearing the whole story, understanding the bigger context of that situation from 5 years ago, offered a kind of closure she didn't know she needed. Marina still had many mixed feelings about it all, but one thing was becoming clear. She was no longer that naive woman from 5 years ago who had allowed herself to be destroyed by a failed relationship. She had grown, matured, built a life and an identity that didn't depend on external validation. And perhaps that was the true victory over the past. Gabriel remained in the neonatal ICU for 6 full days. During that time, Marina witnessed something she didn't expect to see: the deep cracks in Raphael's seemingly perfect marriage. His wife, whom Marina learned was named Julia, rarely visited the baby. When she did appear, she stayed for only a few minutes, always with an excuse about recovering from childbirth or needing to rest at home. But Marina, who knew the reactions of new mothers well, knew there was something more behind that distance. It was Raphael who spent hours in the waiting room, who pressed his face against the ICU glass to observe his son, who asked 1,000 questions about every detail of the treatment. Marina observed all this with a mixture of feelings. On the one hand, She saw the genuine dedication of a father who loved his son unconditionally. On the other, she couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. How life has strange ways of putting us exactly where we need to be, even if it's uncomfortable. One Wednesday afternoon, during one of Marina's breaks, Raphael found her in the hospital break room. He looked exhausted, with deep dark circles under his eyes and unshaven, a stark contrast to the impeccably dressed businessman she had first seen. He asked if he could talk to her for a few minutes, and Marina, despite all her reservations, agreed. They sat at a corner table, each with a cup of cheap hospital coffee, and for the first time in 5 years, had an honest, unmasked conversation. Raphael began by apologizing again, but this time he was more specific. He explained that when he met her 5 years ago, he was at a critical point in his life, questioning everything, including his long-term relationship with Julia, who was his fiancée at the time. Raphael explained that his relationship with Julia had always been more of a family arrangement than a love story. They had known each other since they were teenagers. Their families were close friends and had business dealings in common, and in a way it was always expected that they would end up together. When he had the accident and spent those 2 weeks in the hospital, it was the first time in years that he had time to really think about his life, about what he wanted versus what was expected of him. And then he met Marina. She was everything Julia wasn't: genuine, warm, interested in him as a person, and not as a surname or bank account. Raphael said he fell in love with the simplicity of their conversations, with the way Marina made him feel he could just be himself without having to maintain the facade of a successful businessman. But he was also trapped, committed to a wedding scheduled to take place in 6 months, with entire families involved, with expectations that went far beyond him. He made the cowardly decision to try to live in both worlds simultaneously, knowing it was unsustainable but unable to renounce either. When Marina saw him with Julia at the supermarket, it was the moment reality hit him. He realized he couldn't continue being dishonest with either woman, and he chose the easier path, the path that wouldn't disappoint his family and wouldn't destroy years of planning. He married Julia as planned, trying to convince himself he was making the right choice. But he could never completely forget Marina. Raphael looked at her with genuine sadness and said that seeing Marina again, after all these years, was like receiving a sign from the universe about all the wrong choices he made based on fear and external pressure instead of following his heart. Marina listened silently, processing each word. Part of her felt a bittersweet satisfaction at finally hearing that she hadn't imagined it all, that there had truly been something genuine between them back then. But another part of her felt only a profound sadness for the whole situation, for how people's lives could be shaped by external expectations and internal fears. When Raphael finished speaking, Marina took a deep breath and shared her own perspective. She said that for a long time she blamed herself, questioned her own judgment, and allowed that experience to close her heart to any possibility of real connection. She said that the humiliation she felt wasn't just from being rejected, but from feeling invisible, disposable, as if she wasn't important enough to even deserve an honest conversation. Marina explained that she spent years building walls around herself, keeping everyone at a safe distance, convinced that protecting herself was more important than risking feeling that pain again. But now, hearing the whole story, she realized that carrying that weight all this time hadn't changed anything that happened. It had only prevented her from living fully in the present. Marina looked directly into Raphael's eyes and said something she hadn't planned to say, something that came from a deep and sincere place within her. She said she forgave him, not because he deserved or didn't deserve forgiveness, but because she needed to release that weight in order to truly move on. She said that holding on to resentment only poisoned her own life, and that she had wasted too much time allowing that situation to define her future choices. The words came out naturally, and as she said them, Marina felt as if a knot that had been tightening in her chest for 5 years had finally loosened. Raphael was visibly moved by Marina's words. Tears streamed freely down his face, and he made no effort to hide them. He thanked her repeatedly, saying that he neither expected nor deserved her forgiveness, but that it meant more to him than she could imagine. They remained silent for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts, processing everything that had been said. It was a healing moment, not only for Marina but also for Raphael, who clearly carried his own guilt and regrets about the situation. When they finally got up to return to work, there was a different lightness between them, as if a chapter could finally be properly closed. In the following days, Marina continued caring for Gabriel professionally, but there was an inner peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She realized that the reunion with Raphael, however painful it had been initially, was exactly what she needed to finally make peace with that period of her life. Gabriel was discharged from the neonatal ICU on a sunny Friday. The doctors were confident that he had fully recovered and could finally go home. Marina was on duty when Raphael came to pick up the baby. He seemed different, somehow lighter, despite all the tension still visible on his face. Julia was with him this time, although she maintained a certain emotional distance from the whole situation. Marina took care of the final discharge procedures, giving detailed instructions on home care, explaining warning signs they should watch for, ensuring everything was properly documented. It was her way of ensuring that this innocent baby had the best chance of growing up healthy and happy, regardless of all the complications in the story between the adults around him. When the moment of final farewell arrived, Raphael held Marina's hand for a brief moment and thanked her not only for the medical care, but for everything else implied in his words. Marina simply nodded, wished the family good luck, and watched as they left the hospital, carrying little Gabriel in his car seat. She thought that would be the end of the story, that they would go their separate ways and probably never cross paths again. But life, as Marina was learning, rarely followed predictable scripts. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Monday morning, Marina was organizing medications when the head nurse called her into a meeting in her office. Marina had no idea what to expect, mentally reviewing her last few days at work, trying to identify any mistakes she might have made. When she entered the room, she found the head nurse with a serious expression, but there was something in her eyes that Marina couldn't quite decipher. The head nurse explained that she had received a very unusual call that morning. It was from Raphael, but not about baby Gabriel, whose health remained excellent. It was about Marina. Raphael had called to formally report the exceptional care Marina had shown during his son's hospitalization, not only technically but also humanly. He had even sent a detailed letter praising her dedication, professionalism, and compassion. But that wasn't all. Raphael had also mentioned to the hospital director, who was apparently known to his family, that he was looking for highly qualified healthcare professionals for a new social project his company was developing, a community clinic in an underprivileged area of the city, and that Marina would be the perfect person to lead the nursing team. Marina was completely speechless. She hadn't expected this. She didn't know how to process this information. The head nurse went on to explain that the offer included a significantly better salary than she received at the hospital, as well as the opportunity to truly make a difference in a community that desperately needed access to quality health care. But it came with an obvious complication. It would mean working on a project conceived and funded by Raphael, which would inevitably put them in contact again. The head nurse made it clear that the decision was entirely Marina's, that there was no pressure to accept, and that her position at the hospital was guaranteed regardless of her choice. Marina asked for a few days to think it over, and the head nurse readily agreed. For the rest of that day and the following days, Marina was torn between excitement about the professional opportunity and caution about getting involved again, even professionally, with Raphael. She talked to Patricia, her only colleague she truly trusted, although she didn't reveal the whole complicated story. Patricia encouraged her to consider the opportunity for what it was, a chance for professional growth and real social impact, not a decision about Raphael. Marina also reflected a lot alone, on long night walks through her neighborhood, trying to understand her own feelings and motivations. She realized that for years she had made decisions based on the fear of getting hurt again, the fear of being vulnerable, the fear of taking risks. But now, after finally having that honest conversation with Raphael, after offering forgiveness and finding her own inner peace, she found herself at a crossroads. She could remain in her comfort zone, safe but stagnant, or she could take a leap of faith and trust that she was strong enough to handle any complexity that came her way. After 4 days of intense reflection, Marina made her decision. She would accept the offer. But not because of Raphael, not to try to rewrite the past or feed any fantasy about what could have been. She would accept because it was genuinely an extraordinary opportunity to do the kind of work she had always dreamed of doing, to use her skills to serve people who truly needed and lacked adequate access to health care. And she would accept because she finally trusted herself enough to know that she could maintain healthy professional boundaries, that she didn't need to avoid potentially uncomfortable situations just for fear of not being able to handle them. Marina scheduled a meeting with Raphael to discuss the details of the project. They met at a neutral cafe, far from both the hospital and his office. Raphael arrived punctually, now back to his well-dressed and confident businessman persona. But Marina noticed a subtle difference in his eyes, a humility that hadn't been there before. He presented the project in detail, a comprehensive clinic that would offer everything from basic care to some more complex procedures, completely free for the local community. There would be a multidisciplinary team, including doctors, nurses, social workers, and health educators. Marina would be responsible for assembling and leading the entire nursing team, selecting professionals, developing care protocols, essentially building that department from scratch. It was an enormous responsibility, but also exactly the kind of challenge Marina had secretly desired for years. Raphael made it very clear that his involvement in the day-to-day running of the clinic would be minimal, that he was primarily involved as a funder, and that there would be a complete administrative structure between them, minimizing any unnecessary direct interaction. Marina spent the next 2 months immersed in the project. She worked tirelessly to recruit the best nursing professionals she knew, dedicated people who shared her vision of accessible and humanized healthcare. She developed detailed protocols, organized training, and ensured that all necessary equipment was acquired and properly installed. It was the most energizing and rewarding period of her career. For the first time in years, Marina woke up every day with a sense of purpose that went beyond routine, with the genuine excitement of building something meaningful. During this time, she occasionally crossed paths with Raphael at project meetings, but their interactions were strictly professional and curiously comfortable. It seemed that they had both found a way to coexist in the present without being defined by the past. Marina noticed that Raphael never mentioned his wife, Julia, on these occasions, and although she felt curious, she didn't ask. It was no longer her concern, and she was genuinely happy to keep things that way. The clinic's inauguration was scheduled for a Saturday morning. There was a small ceremony with local authorities, community representatives, and of course, Raphael as the project's main funder. Marina was nervous, unaccustomed to being the center of attention. But when the time came to speak about the nursing staff's work, she felt a deep-seated confidence. She spoke about the importance of accessible health care, about how every person deserved to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their economic situation, about how that clinic represented hope for an entire community. As she spoke, she saw tears in the eyes of several people in the audience, including Raphael, and felt that she was finally exactly where she should be. The first few months of the clinic's operation were intense, but incredibly rewarding. Marina and her team attended to dozens of patients daily, from babies needing vaccinations to elderly people with chronic conditions who had never received adequate treatment. Each day brought new challenges, but it also confirmed for Marina that she had made the right decision. She was making a real difference in people's lives, and that feeling was more satisfying than any salary increase could be. One day, about 4 months after the opening, Marina was finishing her shift when the receptionist informed her that someone was waiting to speak with her. To her surprise, it was Julia, Raphael's wife. Marina felt her stomach clench, not knowing what to expect from this encounter. Julia was elegant as always, but there was something different about her face, a vulnerability that Marina hadn't seen before. They sat in a private room, and Julia got straight to the point. She said she knew about the story between Marina and Raphael, that he had told her everything a few weeks earlier, amidst a discussion about the future of their marriage. Julia explained that they had decided to separate, that Gabriel's birth had made it impossible to continue pretending they had a real marriage. She said she didn't blame Marina for anything, that she actually understood that Raphael had behaved badly towards both of them in different ways. Julia then said something Marina didn't expect. She wanted to thank her. Thank her because Marina's existence in Raphael's life, even as a memory, had eventually forced him to confront his own cowardly choices and finally have the courage to admit he was living a lie. Julia said that although the end of the marriage was painful, it was also liberating, and that now they would both have the chance to find genuine happiness, whether together or apart, but at least with honesty. Marina was deeply touched by the honesty and lack of bitterness in Julia's words. They talked for almost an hour. Two women who had been inadvertently connected by a man's choices, but who now chose to see each other as whole people, not just roles in someone else's drama. When Julia left, Marina was alone in the room for a few minutes, processing everything. It was strange how life went in circles, how people came and went from our lives at specific moments, teaching lessons we didn't know we needed to learn. 2 weeks after that meeting, Raphael showed up at the clinic at the end of the day. Marina was alone in her office finishing paperwork when he knocked on the door. He asked if he could come in, and she agreed. Raphael seemed different once again, lighter, but also more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He talked about the separation, about how he and Julia were working on a shared custody agreement for Gabriel, about how he was finally living honestly for the first time in years. And then he said something that made Marina's heart skip a beat. He said he wasn't there to ask for a second chance, that he perfectly understood he had caused too much damage and that she had moved on with her life. He was simply there to say that seeing Marina thrive, seeing her shine doing the work she loved, had been one of the greatest privileges of his life. He said that Marina had taught him, even unintentionally, about the importance of living authentically, of making choices based on real values and not on external expectations. And he wanted her to know that regardless of what the future held for either of them, he would always be grateful for having crossed her path, even if in such an imperfect way. Marina listened to Raphael with a mixture of emotions that would be impossible to fully describe. There was sadness for the lost time and unnecessary pain of the past. There was gratitude for his belated but genuine honesty. And there was also, she had to admit to herself, a lingering affection for that flawed but fundamentally well-intentioned man. But Marina also knew something important about herself now. She didn't need Raphael to complete her. She didn't need external validation to feel valued. She didn't need to rewrite the past to find peace with it. She looked at Raphael and smiled, a genuine and warm smile, but also, in a way, final. She said she forgave him not just in words, but truly, from the bottom of her heart. She said she appreciated his honesty now and respected the courage he needed to finally live according to his true values. But she also said, gently but firmly, that some chapters of life need to be closed so that new ones can begin. That perhaps they had met at the wrong time, under the wrong circumstances, but that this did not diminish what each had taught the other. Raphael seemed to understand perfectly. He nodded, tears welling in his eyes, and thanked her once more before getting up to leave. At the door, he turned one last time and said he would continue to support the clinic financially because he genuinely believed in the work being done there, but that he would keep his distance so that Marina could have the space she deserved to flourish without complications. It was a mature, respectful, and, in a way, beautiful farewell in its sadness. Marina was alone in her office after he left, but she didn't feel empty or abandoned. On the contrary, she felt a sense of completeness, as if a circle had finally closed properly. Months turned into a year, and the clinic flourished under Marina's leadership. She became a respected figure in the community, known not only for her technical expertise, but also for her genuine compassion. Marina began giving lectures at universities on community health care, was interviewed by medical publications, and even received an award from the state health department recognizing her groundbreaking work. But more important than any external recognition was the inner satisfaction she felt every day. For the first time in her life, Marina wasn't just surviving or fulfilling obligations. She was truly living according to her values and doing work that had real meaning. In her personal life, Marina also began to open her heart again, in small but significant ways. She accepted invitations to hang out with colleagues after work, started attending a book club in her neighborhood, and even signed up for dance classes she had always wanted to take but never had the courage to. She began dating casually, without pressure or heavy expectations, simply allowing herself to meet people and enjoy human companionship. No relationship had become serious yet, but Marina wasn't in a hurry. She had learned that being happy alone was a prerequisite for being happy with someone else, not the other way around. Raphael kept his word about maintaining distance. Although he continued to generously fund the clinic and occasionally appeared at public events related to the project. Their interactions were always cordial but brief, and Marina appreciated that they had both found a healthy balance. She learned through inevitable gossip that Raphael was focused on being a good father to Gabriel and that he wasn't in any serious relationship. But that was no longer her concern. She genuinely wished he would find his own happiness, but it didn't need to involve her. On a quiet spring Sunday, almost 2 years after that shocking first reunion at the hospital, Marina was at home organizing old photos when she found a picture of herself at 27, shortly before meeting Raphael. She looked at that younger version of herself and felt a wave of tenderness. That Marina was so serious, so focused on proving her worth through work, so afraid to allow herself to be vulnerable. She had been through so much since then, had been hurt but also healed, had fallen but also risen stronger. The experience with Raphael, however painful, had been a catalyst for growth she didn't know she needed. It had forced her to confront her own patterns of excessive self-protection, to question her emotional walls, to eventually find a healthier balance between caring for herself and opening herself to genuine connections. Marina put the photo away with a smile and looked out the window, watching children playing in the nearby park, couples walking hand in hand, elderly people sitting on benches enjoying the sun. Life always went on, with its joys and sorrows intertwined, with its lessons sometimes disguised as tragedies, and its blessings hidden within challenges. She thought of all the patients she had cared for over the years, of all the stories she had witnessed, of all the human resilience she had observed, and she felt deeply grateful for her own journey, with all its imperfections and unexpected detours. That night, Marina wrote in her diary something she hadn't written in years. She wrote about hope, about new beginnings, about the courage to continue believing in good things, even after experiencing disappointment. And for the first time, she wrote about being genuinely happy, not despite what she had been through, but in a way, because of it. 3 years after Gabriel's birth and 2 years after taking over leadership at the clinic, Marina received an unexpected invitation. It was for a national nursing conference where she had been selected as one of the keynote speakers. The conference theme was resilience and humanization in healthcare, and they wanted her to share her experience transforming the community clinic into a successful model. Marina accepted the invitation, nervous but also honored. On the day of the talk, she stood backstage listening to her introduction, hearing someone list her achievements and credentials, and barely recognized the person being described as herself. When she stepped onto the stage and looked at the audience of hundreds of healthcare professionals, she felt a moment of panic, but then saw attentive and interested faces, people who genuinely wanted to hear what she had to share. Marina began her talk not with statistics or theories, but with a story. She told about a nurse who once allowed a painful experience to define years of her life, who built walls so high that she almost lost the ability to do the work she loved the way it should be done, with an open heart. She didn't mention names or specific details, but she spoke about humiliation, about forgiveness, about finding strength in vulnerability. She spoke about how the best healthcare comes from professionals who aren't afraid to be human, who allow their own experiences of pain and healing to inform how they treat others. The audience was absolutely silent, captivated. When Marina finished, there were a few seconds of silence before a spontaneous standing ovation. People came to talk to her afterward, many with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of struggle and overcoming. Marina realized that her story, which she had kept as a shameful secret for so long, was actually a source of connection and inspiration when shared authentically. In the months following that conference, Marina began receiving invitations from other institutions, requests to mentor young nurses, and opportunities to expand the clinic model to other communities. Her life was fuller and richer than she had ever imagined possible. But she also learned the importance of balance, of saying no when necessary, of protecting her own well-being so she could continue caring for others effectively. On a sunny autumn afternoon, Marina was walking in the park near her home when she saw Raphael sitting on a bench with Gabriel, now a 3-year-old, running around him chasing pigeons. She hesitated for a moment, considering whether she should simply continue walking, but then Gabriel tripped and fell, and her nurse's instinct kicked in. She approached to check if the boy was all right. Gabriel looked at her with big, curious eyes, completely oblivious to the complex story between the adults around him. Raphael saw her and smiled. A genuine smile, but without expectations. They chatted briefly while Gabriel resumed playing. A light conversation about how beautiful the weather was, about how fast Gabriel was growing, about nothing and everything at the same time. There was no tension, no unresolved weight, just two human beings who once meant something to each other and could now simply exist in the same space with kindness. When Marina said goodbye and continued her walk, she found herself smiling. Not because there was any chance of rekindling what once existed, but because that interaction proved something important. Genuine healing doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending that difficult things never happened. It means being able to look back without paralyzing pain. It means being able to coexist peacefully with memories that once caused torment. It means transforming wounds into wisdom and scars into symbols of survival. Marina arrived home that afternoon with a renewed clarity about her own journey. She called her mother, something she didn't do often enough, and for the first time in years, spoke openly about what she had gone through with Raphael and how that experience had shaped so many of her choices. Her mother listened in silence, and when Marina finished, she said something simple yet profound. That she always knew her daughter was stronger than she imagined, and that watching Marina rise and build a meaningful life was one of the greatest joys of her life. That conversation with her mother opened a door Marina didn't know was closed. She began to reconnect with her family in deeper ways, visiting her parents more often, sharing not only victories but also vulnerabilities, allowing the people who loved her to truly know her. The following years were marked by continuous growth, both professionally and personally. The community clinic Marina led expanded its operations, opening 2 branches in adjacent neighborhoods and serving thousands of patients annually. Marina trained a new generation of nurses, passing on not only technical knowledge, but also the philosophy of humanized care that became her hallmark. She published articles in specialized journals, was invited to public health policy committees, and became a respected voice in discussions about access to health care. But perhaps more significant than any professional achievement was the transformation in her personal life. Marina met Daniel in a completely unexpected circumstance. He was the brother of one of her most beloved patients, an elderly lady named Donna Amelia, who had diabetes and visited the clinic regularly. Daniel was a history teacher at a public school, a calm and reflective man with a subtle sense of humor that made Marina laugh in ways she had forgotten were possible. They started as friends, chatting at length in the waiting rooms, while Daniel accompanied his mother to appointments. There wasn't that dramatic, instant spark that Marina had experienced with Raphael. Instead, it was something slower and more solid, built on genuine conversations, shared values, and mutual respect. When Daniel finally asked Marina to dinner, she accepted without the layers of fear and hesitation that would have dominated her years ago. She was ready, finally, to allow herself to be seen completely by someone, including all the imperfect and scarred parts. And Daniel, with his infinite patience and his ability to truly listen, proved to be exactly the kind of partner Marina didn't even know she was looking for. Someone who challenged her to grow but also accepted her exactly as she was. 2 years after they started dating, Daniel proposed to Marina in a way that was perfectly suited to both of them. Without much fanfare or drama, just a walk in the same park where she had met Raphael and Gabriel years before, a simple ring that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother, and an honest question about building a life together. Marina said yes without hesitation, without fear, without the inner voice of doubt that would have dominated her in the past. They married in a small, intimate ceremony with close family and dear friends, including several of Marina's colleagues and some of the patients who had become part of her extended family. It was a day of pure and simple joy, without pretension or attempts to impress, just two people publicly committing to something they already knew to be true in their hearts. During the reception, Patricia, her nurse friend, made an emotional toast, speaking about how she had witnessed Marina's transformation over the years, from a reserved and guarded woman to someone who radiated warmth and openness. Marina listened with tears in her eyes, realizing that her journey wasn't just about overcoming humiliation or forgiving someone who hurt her. It was about learning to trust herself, about discovering that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the greatest form of courage. On their honeymoon, Marina and Daniel traveled to a small coastal town where they spent days walking on the beach, reading in hammocks to the sound of the waves, and talking about their dreams for the future. They talked about the possibility of having children, about further expanding the clinic's work, about growing old together surrounded by purpose and love. These were conversations full of hope and planning, but also with the shared understanding that life rarely follows plans perfectly, and that the important thing was to face whatever came together with honesty and compassion. Marina never had direct contact with Raphael again after that chance encounter in the park years ago. She learned through mutual acquaintances that he eventually found a new relationship, that Gabriel was growing up healthy and happy, that Raphael was genuinely more at peace with himself. Marina was happy for him, sincerely, without any residual bitterness. That chapter of her life was closed in a healthy and complete way, allowing both of them to move on. The community clinic, however, continued to be partially funded by Raphael's family foundation, although all interactions were purely administrative and through intermediaries. The legacy of that difficult reunion was not prolonged pain, but rather the opportunity that eventually arose from it, the chance for Marina to do work that genuinely mattered. In a strange way, she was grateful for the entire sequence of events, including the painful parts, because they led her exactly to where she needed to be. At 40, Marina looked at her life with a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with authenticity. She had built a meaningful career, a marriage based on genuine partnership, a network of deep and honest relationships. She had learned the most important lesson life had to teach: that our worth doesn't depend on who loves or rejects us, who sees or ignores us, but rather on how we choose to get up after falling, how we transform pain into wisdom, how we continue to open our hearts even after they have been broken. Marina became a mentor to countless young nurses who passed through the clinic, many of them carrying their own stories of struggle and doubt. She always found time to truly listen, to share not only technical knowledge, but also life wisdom. And she always emphasized the same message, that being a healthcare professional requires being human first, that it is impossible to truly care for others if we are not willing to do the difficult work of caring for ourselves as well. On a particularly busy afternoon at the clinic, Marina was attending to a young mother with her newborn baby when something unexpected happened. The young woman was nervous, a first-time mother, clearly overwhelmed by all the new responsibility. She began to cry, saying she felt like a failure, that she wasn't breastfeeding properly, that she was afraid she wasn't good enough for her child. Marina held the young woman's hand and spoke with a gentleness that came from lived experience. She said that being vulnerable, admitting when we need help, recognizing our limitations, these are not weaknesses but the first steps to true strength. She helped the young mother with practical breastfeeding techniques, but more importantly, she offered something she herself had taken years to find: compassion without judgment, unconditional acceptance, the message that making mistakes and struggling doesn't make us failures. It makes us human. When the young mother left the appointment, transformed, smiling through her tears, profusely grateful, Marina felt that familiar sense of purpose fulfilled. This was the work she was born for. Not just treating physical symptoms, but also healing emotional wounds. Not just dispensing medication, but also offering hope. That night, at home with Daniel, Marina shared the young mother's story. Daniel listened attentively, as he always did, and then commented on something that made Marina stop and reflect. He said that the biggest difference between who she was now and who she was years ago wasn't in her external achievements, however impressive they might be, but in how she allowed herself to be present with others, vulnerable and strong simultaneously. Marina realized he was absolutely right. The woman who met Raphael so many years ago was so focused on protecting herself that she could never truly connect. The woman she had become had learned that true connection requires risks, and that those risks, however frightening, are always worth it. 15 years after that initial reunion that changed everything, Marina was giving another lecture, this time at a university training future healthcare professionals. She had been invited to speak about her journey, about the lessons learned over decades of work. Marina, now 47, looked at the audience of young, hopeful faces and saw reflections of who she once was, idealistic but also frightened, eager to make a difference but insecure about her own abilities. She decided to be completely honest with them, more honest than she normally would be in a formal academic setting. She told her story, not just the inspiring parts, but also the difficult parts, the shameful parts, the parts where she failed and fell and doubted herself. She spoke about how she allowed a painful relationship experience to almost destroy her ability to be the nurse she wanted to be, about how it took her years to learn to separate personal value from external validation. She spoke about humiliation, about forgiveness, about slow and difficult growth. And then she looked at those students and said the most important thing she had to share, that their greatest strengths as healthcare professionals will come not from avoiding pain or failure, but from how they choose to respond when they inevitably encounter them. That it is not the absence of wounds that will make them great nurses or doctors, but rather what they learn in the healing process. That vulnerability, when combined with competence and healthy boundaries, is not weakness, but the essence of truly human care. The audience was completely silent, absorbing every word. When Marina finished, there was not only applause, but also visible tears on many faces. Several students approached afterward to thank her, to share their own struggles, to say that for the first time they felt allowed to be imperfect humans while aspiring to professional excellence. That night, driving home after the lecture, Marina reflected on the full arc of her journey. She thought of the 27-year-old Marina who first met Raphael, so eager to be seen and loved that she was willing to ignore warning signs. She thought of the 32-year-old Marina who reunited with Raphael in the hospital, still carrying so much unresolved weight that she could barely function that day. And she looked at the Marina who was now 47 years old, happily married, mother of two adopted children whom she and Daniel had taken in 3 years prior, a respected leader in her field, but most importantly, a woman at peace with herself. All these versions of Marina were the same person, but also fundamentally different, shaped by choices and experiences and deliberate growth. Marina realized that her story was never really about Raphael, although he had been an important catalyst. It was about her own journey of self-discovery, about learning to value herself independently of who else valued her, about finding purpose that transcended external validation. It was about transforming the experience of being humiliated into fuel to build something meaningful, about transforming pain into empathy that could serve thousands of others. When Marina arrived home that night, Daniel was helping the children with their homework at the kitchen table. The scene was perfectly ordinary and also perfectly wonderful. She paused in the doorway for a moment, just observing, feeling a deep gratitude for every tortuous step that had brought her to this very moment. Her scars still existed, probably always would, but they no longer bled. They were simply part of her story, reminders of where she had been and how far she had come. Marina went inside, kissed Daniel, hugged her children, and sat down to dinner with her imperfect and absolutely perfect family. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking back with regret or forward with anxiety. She was completely present, completely at peace, completely herself. 20 years after that fateful day when Marina first saw Raphael as the father of a newborn, she sat in her office at the main clinic, now expanded into a full community health complex, serving 5 different neighborhoods. Marina was 52, her hair beginning to gray, which she didn't bother to dye, the lines around her eyes telling stories of laughter and tears equally lived. She was reviewing proposals for a new mental health program when her assistant came in and said there was a young man in the reception area asking specifically for her. Something in the assistant's tone made Marina look up curiously. When Marina went out to the reception area, she saw a young man of about 20, tall, with familiar brown eyes. It took only a second for her to recognize who he was, even though she had last seen him as a tiny baby battling infection. Gabriel. Raphael's son, now a young man, was there, nervous but determined. He explained that he was studying medicine, interested in public health, and when he researched the best community programs in the region, Marina's name came up repeatedly. Only then did he make the connection, remembering stories his father had told about the nurse who saved his life as a baby and who ended up building something extraordinary. Gabriel said he didn't know if it would be appropriate to show up like that, but he felt he needed to meet the person who, in direct and indirect ways, had impacted his family so much. Marina invited Gabriel to her office, and they talked for over an hour. He told her about his childhood, about his parents' amicable divorce when he was 6, about how they both eventually found new partners and built harmonious families. He spoke about how his father's dedication to the foundation that funded clinics like Marina's had influenced his own career choice in medicine, focused on underserved communities. And he said something that made Marina's heart clench, that his father had spoken to him about a special nurse who, many years ago, taught him the importance of living with integrity and honesty, and that lesson had completely transformed the trajectory of his life. Gabriel didn't know all the details of the story between Marina and Raphael, and Marina saw no need to clarify them. Some stories are meant to be kept private, not out of shame, but because their value lies in the private lessons they taught, not in the public details. She simply smiled and said she was honored to have made any difference, and that she was even more honored to meet him now as a young man clearly committed to making his own difference in the world. When Gabriel left, promising to return to learn more about the clinic's work, Marina was alone for a few moments, absorbing the surprising symmetry of that encounter. Life truly had mysterious ways of completing circles we thought had been left open. Marina picked up her phone and texted Daniel, simply saying she had an incredible story to tell when she got home. And then she went back to work, because there was always more work to do, more lives to touch, more difference to make. Marina's story wasn't about finding a perfect happy ending. It was about building a meaningful life brick by choice, by act of courage. It was about transforming humiliation into strength, pain into wisdom, and scars into symbols of survival and growth. And in that sense, her story wasn't just hers, but the story of all the people who have been knocked down and chosen to get up, who have been hurt and chosen to heal, who have doubted their worth and chosen to believe again. This is the story of Marina, a nurse who was humiliated, who discovered painful truths about her past, but who chose not to let that define her future. It's a story about the long and difficult journey of forgiveness, about the courage to keep opening your heart even after it has been broken, about the beauty of building an authentic and meaningful life, regardless of where we start or how many times we fall along the way.